what we need is to build an ecological civilization. And that's not just a question of tweaking this policy or tweaking that policy. It's a question of saying our primary role must be to stay within planetary boundaries while ensuring that everybody has a decent quality of life.
Welcome to the Challenging Climate Podcast, where we discuss the big ideas and controversies in climate change with leading experts. I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy specialist.
And I'm Pete Irvin, a climate scientist. The climate is changing. Join us as we try to keep up. In this episode, we speak with renowned British environmental writer George Monbiot.
George has been a regular columnist at The Guardian since 1996, gaining recognition for his insightful and often provocative articles on environmental, political, and economic subjects. He is the author of more than a dozen books, most recently being Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. And George was awarded the Orwell Prize for Journalism in 2022.
George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Jesse.
So we thought that, given your long record reporting and advocating on environmental issues in the UK, that we'd start by asking you to lay out how the UK is doing on climate and change and environmental issues more broadly.
Not very well at all. We were doing well because of the dash for gas, and this goes back a long way, where we swapped out coal-burning power stations for gas burners and then gradually reduced the penetration of gas and brought in a lot more renewables. And in fact, the UK is very well cited for renewables, particularly for wind power. We have shallow seas with lots of wind blowing over them, and they're ideal for generating electricity. So we've done what could be considered the easy bit. And it's the easy bit because it's remote. It doesn't have any effect on people's lives. You turn on the light switch, the lights come on, and you don't care where the electricity comes from as long as the electricity is there. And with modern grid balancing and all the rest of it, the electricity will be there. And so there's almost no political cost. Of course, the fossil fuel industry has tried to raise the political cost of it. All sorts of conspiracy theories and attacks on anything resembling a green agenda, but they haven't been very successful where power generation is concerned. But all the more difficult stuff has been perpetually shunted into the future. So if you take transport, for example, we've completely flatlined on transport emissions. We're just not reducing them. And the reason is that whenever anybody attempts even the mildest measure, you get a massive backlash and all this talk in the newspapers of a war against the motorist. A war, incidentally, in which motorists are never killed, but lots of pedestrians and cyclists are killed by motorists. If there's any war going on, it's the other way around. But that's not the way it's portrayed. And again, this massive plethora of conspiracy theories about 15-minute cities and low traffic neighborhoods and ultra-low emission zones and stuff, which just are designed to make it as difficult as possible to navigate, to demoralize people, to confuse them, to distract from the need to take action with transport. Where homes are concerned, this is the biggest lost opportunity of all because we currently have a 2-year program for subsidising people's energy bills, which is costing the government £78 billion. But for £8 billion, you could insulate the 3 million homes which are most in need of insulation. And so the current policy is the mother of all false economies. You're pouring money into subsidising people's purchase of fossil fuels, whereas if you were to put in a much smaller amount of money into upgrading the energy efficiency of people's homes, you could greatly reduce their fuel bills while making people warmer and cozier. What's not to like? Well, the only thing not to like is that it damages fossil fuel profits. And surprise, surprise, the government has sided with the profits of fossil fuel companies. So there's loads of missed opportunities. There's lots of political cowardice, which isn't confined to the Tories. The last Labour administration, back in the days when dinosaurs roamed the earth, was also pretty pathetic in facing up to these more difficult issues, in anything which requires us to make an effort rather than some distant authority doing it in ways that we don't even notice.
So looking ahead, you've given some ways in which we could do better, and some of them seem fairly obvious and have little political cost to them. But if Britain was to get to a place that you'd consider sustainable in, say, 2050, what would change or what would have to change?
Well, I've so far mentioned just things directly involved with climate, but of course, climate is just one part of the Earth systems that we have to respect and we have to work within. And of course, It's a bit like the human body. Every organ in your body can be perfectly healthy, but one organ misfires and you're in serious trouble. You could die as a result of it. And we've got to look at all Earth systems and make sure that all those Earth systems can continue to sustain themselves and continue to sustain us. And our record when it comes to other Earth systems or other components of the Earth system is even worse than our record when it comes to climate. Biodiversity is just falling through the floor in the UK. We're one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, and it's getting much worse. The state of our freshwater systems is just diabolical. The state of our marine systems is horrendous as a result of pollution, but primarily the fishing industry is just wiping out marine ecologies, left, right, and centre, all around the UK, and there's hardly any effective protection going on. We are terrible when it comes to wider pollution issues, such as microplastics pollution, such as pollution by organic chemicals, exemplified, for example, in the spreading of deliberately contaminated sewage sludge across farmland, which currently remains within the remit of government policy. I was going to say it remains legal, but we're actually testing the legality of that. A group of us called Fighting Dirty are launching a judicial review against the government, and we're arguing it's not legal. I mean, it certainly shouldn't be legal to be spreading sewage sludge with which industrial wastes have been deliberately mixed across hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland. I mean, this is absolutely massive scandal. Similarly, with waste disposal, which is basically being taken over by the mafia in this country, the government's just sitting back and letting that happen. On and on and on it goes. What we need is to build an ecological civilization. And that's not just a question of tweaking this policy or tweaking that policy. It's a question of saying our primary role must be to stay within planetary boundaries while ensuring that everybody has a decent quality of life. And to do that, we have to dethrone GDP as being the measure of success. And the measure of success must become, how well are we living within the planetary space? How well are we ensuring that everybody is living well within those planetary boundaries? And that requires a complete change of mindset.
Yes, I think about the UK's recent politics around this. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak recently ruled out several policies which you might be in favour of. Policies that weren't actually in place, but which they pulled back on, which is, I think, things including reducing meat and dairy consumption, encouraging car sharing, greater taxes on flights. What does it say about the prospects of such policies being enacted if right-wing parties are using them to scare voters in the hopes of winning them over? And it seems that left-wing parties aren't picking them up.
No, worse still, I think right-wing parties are using them as culture war fodder, as a way of distracting people from their own failures and saying, they're coming for your car, or they're coming for your hamburger, or they're coming for your ... Those Labour people represent some demonic threat to the way you want to live. And sadly, tragically, Labour playing along with that, saying, oh, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be spending £28 billion on green measures because then the Tories will use that as a stick to beat us with. My approach would be, bring it on. Let the Tories show that they are trashing the fabric of the nation. These so-called patriots who are literally tearing our country apart. Let them show that. And let the Labour Party uphold the green measures which people want to see. Let's protect the nation. Let's be true patriots. Let's look after this country. Let's look after the soil. Let's look after the rivers. Let's look after all that makes it beautiful and wonderful, and create a sort of permanent habitability here, as opposed to what could very well be a place which becomes harder and harder to live a comfortable and well-resourced life for the majority of people, because that's the way it's going. With extreme weather, with floods, with all the other issues which we now confront. It would be so easy to own that policy. And it's pretty depressing that Labour are being so cowardly about it.
I wonder, because you were saying that the UK has made quite a bit of progress at cutting emissions. It's down by a quarter in consumption terms. But I think
Can I just change it? The UK did make progress at cutting emissions. There was a period during which we had steep cuts, and then ever since then, it is more or less flatlined.
Well, I guess kind of building on that, it seems we've done some of the easy things, but I guess some of the stuff you're talking about sounds good. What about when it starts impacting people's lives? People do care about the freedom the car offers them. They don't want their houses to be changed in ways that are out of their control. They don't want to pay more for things. How will these difficult policies that impact people's lives and choices be implemented? Do you imagine this should be done through higher prices or through restricting action? How should these difficult choices be realized in people's lives?
Well, first of all, let's look at the optics and the language of it. Because when it comes to economic issues, successive Conservative governments have said, yeah, this is going to hurt, but in the long term, you'll be better off for it. We're going to cut public services. We're going to slash taxes for rich people. We're going to shut down Sure Start centres, shut down community centres, etc., do all these things which damage our lives. But you will benefit from it in the long term. Now, the fact is that we benefit from that neither in the short term nor in the long term. The jam tomorrow is always promised, but it never arrives from those austerity programs which have been pursued ever since Mrs. Thatcher. With the privatisation, the sell-off, all the rest of it, it was going to be pain today for gain tomorrow. And there is no gain tomorrow. But they managed to sell that fine. Governments keep getting re-elected on a platform of saying there are sunlit uplands. They might be in the distance, but you will get there if you only are prepared to suffer this pain today. When it comes to environmental issues, where there really is a payoff between splurging our consumption today and the habitability of this country in the future, they absolutely will not make those same arguments. So what I'm saying is the arguments can certainly be made and they can certainly be highly effective, but they're only being made when it comes to the so-called economic health of our country and these promises which never materialize. But they're not being made when it comes to our environmental health. So, it's not the impossible mountain, which so many people portray it as. We'll never persuade people that they must take a short-term hit, that they must change anything, that they must give up anything in order to have something better, or rather, in order to ensure things don't get worse. We can never do that. Of course you can do that. They do it all the time.
So I want to move on. This last few years, I've seen a rise in climate protests, civil disobedience, and some acts of sabotage. What's your views on these tactics?
So I will support anyone who takes non-violent direct action in pursuit of a living planet, a habitable planet. Obviously, some tactics are more effective than others. Some tactics are highly effective at alienating people and not so effective at winning people round. But it's not always a question of winning people round. Sometimes you have to do things which are going to be unpopular, but which make people think. The suffragettes knew that very well. They were extremely unpopular. The suffragettes were even more unpopular than some of the radical climate groups are today. The civil rights campaigns in the US were even more unpopular. Independence movements, anti-apartheid, all of them were demonized and told that they're alienating people and that your tactics are never going to work, and then they win. And sometimes it takes a very colourful and visible tactics in order to concentrate people's minds on what is the greatest predicament that humankind has ever faced. And so, I don't join that chorus of saying, oh, you should never block a road, you should never do this and that. And again, let's look at the double standards here. When farmers or truckers block a road, people don't come and start punching them and kicking them and spitting on them and driving their cars at them. No, they just put up with that. That's fine. When floods block a road, people don't say, oh, those blinking politicians, they allowed this road to be flooded because of climate breakdown. No, they just say, oh, floods are blocking the road. We'll have to take a different road. Only when the climate activists block a road that people go ballistic. And why is that? It's because there's very effective propaganda demonizing those climate activists and saying they're coming for your ... as always. And when you demonize people, those people then become easy to attack. But, so saying, there are some tactics which are more effective than others. I can't always say which ones they are. Generally find out in retrospect which ones work and which ones don't. And environmental journalist and activist now for 39 years, and I cannot tell you what is guaranteed to work and what is not. We have tried everything in that time. And the fundamental problem we face is not whether this particular tactic is alienating or not. It's that we're being outspent by a factor of about 100 to 1. The vast profits from the oil companies, from the meat companies, from all the other organizations which are trashing the living world, only a very small part of those vast profits has to be poured into political lobbying, poured into sponsoring think tanks, poured into whispering into the ear of editors of the billionaire press, etc. And you find yourself always on the back foot because you just don't have that kind of money, you don't have that kind of access, you don't have that kind of influence. I mean, we're confronting a media which is largely in the hands of either billionaires or large corporations. And what billionaires and large corporations want is business as usual, because it's business as usual which got them to where they are today.
Shifting gears a bit, I want to address an aspect of environmentalism in which a number of environmentalists are attracted to what could be called a green world. Green in the sense of living close to nature, bucolic, rolling hills, organic agriculture, free-range chickens, etc. And it can even take on moving from an aesthetic preference to emotional and sometimes even spiritual vision of how humans relate to nature. And this is something that you've scrutinized somewhat, the extent to which such visions are and are not consistent with sustainability. In particular, I saw your recent column on your website, The Cruel Fantasies of Well-Fed People, which we'll put a link to in our show notes, your website being monbiot.com. Can you elaborate a little bit on this tension in the case of agriculture and food systems between green vision and what might actually be sustainable?
Yes, thank you for that. It's, I think, a very important question. Now, I completely understand people's impulses and the idea, the aesthetics, which motivate people to latch onto a particular vision, in particular, what food production might look like, and say, that's what I like the look of, so that's what we need, and that's what should feed the world. And this taps into what the great cognitive historian Jeremy Lent calls root metaphors, ideas so deeply implanted in our minds that we don't even recognize them as ideas anymore. And the pastoral root metaphor, the idea that the shepherd with their flock is the seat of purity and innocence, while the city is evil and corrupt, that goes back literally thousands of years. In the secular tradition, it goes back to the Greek poet Theocritus in the 3rd century BC. In the religious tradition, back to the Old Testament and indeed several other monotheistic religions as well. They have that right their root. These, in some cases, these accounts were written by the descendants of pastoralist people, of shepherds, of cowherds and the rest. And they come right up to the present day. In the late 19th and early 20th century, they took the form of the Westerns, the US, the cowboys with their herds. And these were the pure and innocent and strong and decent people, even though they were part of a colonial genocide at the time, which was wiping out the Native Americans. And then there's been this massive publishing rush in the last 60, 70 years or more of books for very, very young children, pre-literate children, which are about livestock farms, farmyards. And there's one horse, one cow, one pig, one chicken, one cat, one rosy-cheeked farmer, and they all talk to each other, and they're like a big family, and there's no indication of why they might be there, where they might be going, what their fate might be, obviously. And so these notions of livestock farming in particular being something pure and innocent are implanted very deep and very early in our lives. And then they're reinforced by all these endless programs on the BBC. One man and his dog lambing live, etc. If the BBC were any keener on sheep, it would be illegal. And so this constant reinforcement of these root metaphors, of these ideas that there is this kind of farming which is good and pure and right, and those become completely detached from the actual environmental performance of those kinds of farming. So to give you one example, the major farming system in the UK, which has by far the greatest ratio of destruction to production, in other words, it destroys a massive amount while producing very little, is sheep farming in the uplands. It occupies around 4 million hectares of land. That land is completely denuded of trees and the great majority of other species because of sheep grazing. They preferentially browse out tree seedlings because they're very tasty and nutritious. So trees can't then reproduce, the old trees die off, and we get these bare hills, which huge numbers of people believe are natural, but are nothing of the kind. The tree line in most parts of the UK would be at about 4,000 feet. In other words, higher than any part actually is. And so we get this phenomenally destructive industry producing a tiny fraction of our food. I mean, you can barely see it with the naked eye. It's really tiny, tiny proportion of the food we eat is produced by upland sheep farming. And yet this is the system which we all fetishize. Oh, it's so beautiful, it's so authentic, it's so natural. And this word natural, the cultural theorist Raymond Williams said that natural is the most complex word in the English language. And of course, we can load onto it anything that we like. And all this, it's kind of a game, this is what people, particularly comfortable, well-fed people, want to see. And without thinking it through and without questioning whether the aesthetics equals the impacts or whether the aesthetics and the impacts are completely unrelated, they say this is what we want to see everywhere. Now, as a way of feeding all the world's 8 billion people, it's an absolute catastrophe to go down that sort of livestock focused, extensive kind of program because of the huge amount of land it requires. Like in the Welsh Hills and the rest of the British uplands, we're talking about massive extensive land to produce very little. And the same with ranching everywhere. Outdoor livestock production is incredibly land hungry and very, very unproductive. And I feel that people have set the boundaries in all the wrong places. So they've said the problem is intensive farming. And you say, okay, so what's your alternative to that? Extensive farming. Intensive farming's got loads of problems, but extensive farming is even worse because every hectare of land that it occupies is a hectare of land which cannot be occupied by a wild ecosystem. And Earth systems as a whole depend for their survival on wild ecosystems. We can't get through this century or those that follow if we don't have sufficient wild ecosystems. And by far the greatest threat to them is extensive farming, which by definition means using more land to produce a certain amount of food. Or people say the problem is factory farming. And sure, if you're thinking of factory animal farming, it's horrendous. I worked as a teenager on an intensive pig farm. You call it a factory farm. And every day, two thoughts were going through my head. One was, this isn't what they told me farming was about, because of course I'd absorbed all the children's books and the rest of it. And two, why is this legal? If these were cats or dogs that we were farming, we'd all be herded up, put in handcuffs and thrown in prison because of the way we were treating those pigs, just as a matter of course, the way those pigs were farmed. So it's horrendous, and it has horrendous pollution implications. It requires crops to be grown, to be fed to those animals. And so people say, yeah, factory farming is the problem. And you say, okay, so what's the answer to that? Is that not factory farming? Because again, if you're talking about livestock, then you're talking about even greater environmental impacts per kilo of produce produced. I mean, there is no good way of feeding the world's people with animal products. It just can't work. But if your term factory farming means using factories to produce food, well, you're pretty quickly going to starve because almost all the food you eat had at some point passed through a factory. Even if it's produced by an organic grower in the same county as in which you live, it's almost certainly gone through some sorting and grading and packaging process in a factory. It's then been warehoused and it then comes through the retailer to reach you. I mean, even if it's a box scheme, there's something going on it could be a very small factory, but it's basically a factory. And so again, it doesn't really help to use the term factory farming or to say the problem is factory farming, or the problem is industrial farming. The problem is ecologically damaging farming. And what we need to do is to find the most effective ways of feeding the world without devouring the planet. And sometimes, in some cases, there'll be factory farming. For instance, I'm very interested in the farming of microbes. I think there's an enormous potential there. Many microbes have very high food value and their production has very low environmental costs. But what you're going to do is do that in factories. Oh, we can't have that. We can't have factories. Factories? Oh my God, that would be terrible. Okay, right, starve to death then. Stop buying anything which has been through a factory and see how well you get on. Or you can say, well, we need to have systems which some people are developing of intensive agroecology, where you actually can produce a large amount from a small amount of land without necessarily slapping on huge amounts of chemicals. It can be done in some circumstances at least. Oh, but that's intensive agriculture. We can't have intensive agriculture. Well, in some cases, actually, yeah, that is the most appropriate way forward. So, we have to put aside childish things. We have to recognize that image of farming with which we're brought up and which is deeply implanted in our minds and is freighted with cultural baggage isn't necessarily going to be the farming which can feed us with least environmental damage. In fact, in many cases, it's exactly the opposite.
Precisely. The leading threat to biodiversity is the loss of habitat. And the leading driver of that is expanding agriculture, feeding 8 billion people who increasingly want, for example, meat in their diet. And a logical path forward is to intensify agriculture to increase yield per acre or whatever metric one uses. As part of that, in the last couple decades, seems clear that some genetically modified crops can help increase yield, that are part of intensive agriculture, subsequently, perhaps unexpectedly, help preserve biodiversity. How do you see the role of GMOs, including the new techniques of genetic editing as opposed to transgenics, playing a potential role in a sustainable, intensive agriculture?
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm neutral as far as that technology is concerned. If it works, I'm happy to go with it. If it's damaging, I'm not happy to go with it. And I think this is what we should be taking to all these technologies. It's not necessarily the technology itself which is the problem. It can be certain applications of it. It can be the ownership of it, the concentration of that ownership. All these can be big issues. When GMOs were first introduced to the UK, I was among the very first campaigners against them. And I would still campaign against them if they were introduced in the same way. Because the first ones ever proposed to be released here were some viruses which were going to be released by the Institute of Virology into some open-sided greenhouses on the edge of Wytham Woods in Oxford. And these viruses that they'd told us were specific to a particular caterpillar which ate cabbages. And then the alarm was raised by entomologists at the university who said, no, these viruses are not specific at all. They could affect a very wide range of Lepidoptera, of moths and butterflies. And there's absolutely no effective restrictions on this experiment to prevent these viruses from getting out into the wider habitats, into Wytham Woods, into the world as a whole. It was grotesquely irresponsible experimental design. And so a bunch of us dressed up in sleeping bags and antennae, as caterpillars obviously, and occupied the trees and the steps outside the Institute of Virology. And it caused a scandal, quite rightly so. Utterly shocking. It was so lax and so lacking in basic protocols to prevent contamination. And the proposal was withdrawn as a result. Now, I would still do that today. That was an entirely reasonable action to take. And then the next thing that comes is Monsanto comes along and says, hey, we're going to just move in here with these Roundup Ready crops whose primary purpose was to create more road for its proprietary chemical Roundup. And it was very hard to see what good it was going to do. It was being railroaded through. The crops were going to be for livestock feed. They weren't even going to be directly feeding people. And a bunch of us said, well, this is potentially alarming. I wasn't among those who said this is going to poison us or anything like that, but there's got to be a proper regulatory framework here. And until there is, these crops should not be released in the UK. Again, I would still take that action today. But what we've seen subsequently is the development, particularly through gene editing, of crops which require less in the way of chemicals, either of pesticides or of herbicides or of fertilizers, and so can actually reduce environmental impacts through their deployment. Now, in every case, obviously, we should have proper testing, proper consideration, proper public consultation. All the issues should be properly explained rather than just bulldozed through, as Monsanto was trying to do with the Roundup Ready crops. But, if that's done and it turns out that it's not going to lead either to even greater corporate concentration, which remains a big issue right throughout the food chain, or to any adverse environmental impacts, then I'm perfectly happy to see that go ahead.
Let's cover a few more tricky technologies. How about nuclear power? What's your views on that one? It's a very controversial one amongst environmentalists.
Yeah, it is, and not always justifiably. I mean, in the early days, there were really big problems because the civil nuclear industry was intimately connected with the military nuclear industry, and it was very hard to dissociate what it was doing from Armageddon. And I should hope that everyone is against Armageddon and anything which can help to lead us there. And there was an awful lot of military work being done under the guise of civil development and just plenty of crossover between the two industries. Now, that certainly in established countries with established nuclear power is no longer the case. Under the Euratom Treaty, you just can't mix those two things up. And there are new nuclear technologies where it just can't be the case because the power technologies, the civil nuclear applications, have no relevance at all to the development of military applications. And so, again, in those cases, I would say, look, if this helps us to decarbonize, then we shouldn't put unnecessary barriers in its way. And curiously, for me, the sort of moment when I ceased to become a universal anti-nuclear campaigner was the Fukushima disaster, where this nuclear power plant was hit by the biggest natural disaster they could be. I mean, it was listed as a top category of nuclear accident and no one died. And that was a moment when I thought, people die every day in the coal industry. I mean, hundreds of people are killed every day by coal, either in mining accidents, by direct pollution, or as a result of the climate breakdown that it causes. Far, far greater numbers than being killed in the whole of history as a result of any nuclear accidents. And I suddenly realized, came as a bit of a shock, that most of the charges that we'd been leveling against nuclear power actually should have been leveled against coal burning instead. Even the issue of radioactive releases, there is more radioactivity released by coal burning than there is by nuclear power. Teratogenesis, in other words, damage to the fetus in the womb, simply not proven as an outcome of nuclear power. It's just not demonstrated anywhere. But it's a massive problem as a result of heavy metal release from coal-burning power stations. And it's quite similar in some ways to the agricultural issue we're talking about, that broadly speaking, there's a large school of thought which sees what's old as good and what's new as bad. It's neophobia. And even when what's old is demonstrably horrendous, that's got to be better than this new scary thing which someone's trying to impose on us. Now, coal burning, if someone had invented coal burning today, or indeed livestock farming today, we would be absolutely horrified. You mean to do what? You're going to do that to us or that to animals? You're a nutcase. You're a psychopath. You need to be locked up. But because it's been done for so long, it's just, oh yeah, that's just the way of the world. That's just the way it is. And you tolerate that. But then someone comes along with a new technology, like how about brewing bacteria instead of keeping and killing animals? People are absolutely disgusted and horrified. Or how about producing nuclear power as opposed to burning coal? Again, people are horrified by that proposal. And very often that horror is not rooted in any empirical comparison at all. It's just an instinctive reaction. We don't like that. We don't like that kind of thing. Down with this kind of thing. And we just have to try to be more rational about these things. And especially now that we're entering an era of new nuclear technologies such as small modular reactors, which just don't suffer from any of the safety problems that previous generations of nuclear might have suffered from. They don't have any of the long-term disposal problems which previous generations suffered from. In fact, some of the designs could use up the nuclear waste which have been accumulated by the first two generations of nuclear power and for which there is no other obvious useful solution. So we should not just impose these sort of blanket dismissals of entire technologies. And sometimes that dismissal can be extremely harmful, as we saw in Germany, which, following the Fukushima disaster, decided that because the risk of tsunamis in Bavaria was so high, cancelled its entire nuclear program. The result was entirely predictable. In fact, some of us predicted it, that they'd be burning more coal instead. And boy, did they start burning more coal instead. Not just ordinary coal, but lignite, brown coal, the most polluting and disgusting coal of all. Result, far more global heating, far more health damage to the people of Germany and neighbouring countries than was being done before. Totally illogical, highly damaging policy, all done as a result of sentiment rather than evidence.
Another very controversial climate technology that Jesse and I work on is solar geoengineering, in particular stratospheric aerosol geoengineering. This idea that we could create a persistent aerosol haze, particle haze in the upper atmosphere that could scatter some light. This is a very frightening proposal, but it seems to have the potential to reduce some climate risk. What's your view on this idea?
Yeah, I'm not a great fan of it. And the reason really is twofold. One, you'll be totally familiar with all this, of course, but first of all, the moral hazard. Oh, well, we don't need to do anything because we'll be able to scatter particles in the atmosphere and that will deal with it. So let's just carry on. And of course, if you stop scattering particles or find out that there's some problem down the line, which hadn't been obvious from the models, then suddenly you've got this huge amount of background heating, which comes back into the foreground. Secondly, it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, which might be a bit out of date, is that it is actually very hard to predict some of the possible impacts of doing this. For instance, we now know that droughts in the Sahel between the 1960s and the 1980s, which were so devastating to people, might have been linked to the clearing up of sulfur dioxide emissions from industry in the Northern Hemisphere, which then very rapidly and radically changed cloud formation patterns. Now, we were trying to do something very good there, cleaning up our industry, and I don't think anyone would argue that we shouldn't have cleaned up our industry, but it had these unforeseen impacts a long way away. Now, possibly the models have got to the point at which all those impacts would be foreseen, at which we know exactly what is likely to happen if we were to do this on a large scale. But I think, my main objection remains that with governments of the world being what they are today, they could just say, oh, well, not to worry then, we've got this technology down the line which is going to solve everything. Of course, it doesn't solve ocean acidification. It doesn't solve all the associated problems with fossil fuel drilling and spilling and a huge damage to the fabric of the planet. It doesn't solve all the local pollution issues and stuff which are associated with burning fossil fuels, but it will be seen as a green light for business as usual. Let's just keep drilling and keep burning because we've got a fix.
Weren't the same kind of things leveled against, the same arguments leveled against adaptation back in the 90s? We shouldn't talk about it, we shouldn't consider it, we shouldn't implement it because it will distract us from dealing with the root cause of the problem. Is it so bad to tackle the symptoms of a disease in addition to tackling the underlying cause?
Well, adaptation has been, continues to be repeatedly used throughout the right-wing press as an argument against mitigation. We can just adapt to climate breakdown. Oh, if the sea rises, we'll just build sea walls. That's fine. That's all right. We'll move. So what if the tropics become uninhabitable? People can move to Greenland. Greenland's going to be great. We have endless adaptation arguments. There was even a column in the Guardian a few years ago where a certain columnist who I mentioned said, well, cities become uninhabitable, we'll just move them. We'll just move the cities. And so actually, the talk of adaptation can severely undermine the mitigation that we need to do. That doesn't mean that we should not plan and we should not put in place adaptation measures. We need to, and in fact, most governments have totally failed to do that too. But they're very happy to talk about adaptation, particularly when they're doing so as a substitute for mitigation.
Again, shifting gears a bit, in your writing, you have often drawn critical links between environmental issues, particularly climate change, and economic growth. And if I can characterize your position, correct me if I'm wrong, you are concerned that a certain, fetishization of economic growth is distracting us from building what you earlier called an ecological civilization, and you spoke of dethroning GDP. Should the environmental movement call for the limitation or the reduction of economic activity?
Well, the first thing is to stop using GDP as our measure of progress. Now, even the person who first came up with the concept of GDP, Simon Kuznets, said this should not be used as a measure of progress. So what does everyone instantly do? GDP is our measure of progress. No surprises there. That's just how the world works. People latch onto stuff and attach all sorts of things to it which shouldn't be attached to it. And it's a very poor measure of progress because, of course, it captures all economic activity, good or bad. If loads of people die in car accidents or are injured in car accidents, that increases GDP because those people need to be treated, and health treatment is all counted as part of GDP. If we have massive flood disasters and there's huge insurance payouts as a result, that increases GDP. On and on it goes. You can just find endless examples where increments of GDP growth actually reflect things which are really, really bad for us. Really bizarre measure to use of how well you're doing. But we have, the most extreme case is Liz Truss, these fetishists who say this is the be all and end all. And having attempted a program whose sole basis was to create more growth, regardless of what the impacts would be, and the impacts were that it actually crashed the economy that she was trying to grow, she's now set up this growth commission to try and pursue exactly the same program. There's a definition of madness which is continuing to do the same thing while expecting different results. This is it. And unfortunately, to an extent, all governments are doing that. There's no government I know of anywhere in the world which is not pursuing growth in one form or another. There was a while in Costa Rica where they said, no, we're not going to pursue growth. We're going to pursue la pura vida instead, but unfortunately hasn't lasted. So it's, Bhutan, actually, maybe Bhutan with its gross national happiness would be an exception. So good. Maybe there is one exception, but it is the general disease of our times that we have taken this arbitrary measure, a measure which does not reflect our well-being, and use it as a measure of well-being. And in an environmental emergency, it's particularly inappropriate when the growth in consumption is clearly driving a large proportion of that emergency. That is the primary driver of it. And so, absolutely, we need to come up with different measures of how well we're doing and apply those measures instead of this ridiculous and arbitrary thing of how much money is churning through the economy.
GDP is certainly flawed as a metric of having a singular or at least a primary target for a national polity, if you will. But nevertheless, it correlates of things that are what we want. Human Development Index, for example, life expectancy, etc. And it would likely correlate fairly well with Bhutan's measurements of national happiness. So, yeah, changing the measurement might change the issue a bit, but in a way, it just sort of pushes it to another area. So, if we focus in on consumption, let's say, does individual consumption need to be reduced and limited for environmental purposes? If so, how do you square that with democracy? One of the reasons that growth keeps coming back is people want it. It reduces poverty.
Well, it's a bit like what we were talking about with austerity. People are induced to vote for austerity, even when it clearly wrecks everything and stuff. And what we're talking about with austerity is public austerity in public spending in order to generate more private spending, generally, though, by the very rich, by people with disposable income, because most people, it turns out, are struggling even to pay the rent, let alone buy all the luxuries which the rich can buy. So, yeah, people will consistently vote against their own interests. That happens. It has always happened. People are susceptible to persuasion. But one of the attempts to persuade people back has to be to say, imagine a world where Earth systems have broken down, and then imagine how happy you would be in that world. If you're linking consumption growth to happiness, and if that consumption growth leads to the tipping of Earth systems, a collapse in effect of the habitable planet, and huge parts of the planet can no longer support life because they're outside what some scientists call the human climate niche, and basically you just can't grow food there anymore. It's literally too hot to live there anymore, as very large parts of the surface of the planet will become on current trajectories before the end of this century. There's extreme weather, which is repeatedly smashing down your houses, flooding your streets, flooding your home. You just can't live under those circumstances. That is a true recipe for misery. I mean, that really is. If you're linking this to happiness, then our future happiness absolutely depends on limiting the consumption and the burning through of the planet's resources, which we're currently doing.
Also, within matters of economics and sustainability, you have leveled much of your criticism at the wealthiest stratum of society, at the ultra rich, at the top 1%, etc. It's true that, of course, the ultra wealthy consume more and therefore have a greater environmental impact, release more greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we see much support for environmental issues coming from certain members of the ultra wealthy, the Bill Gates and the Hewlett Foundation and George Soros's Open Society Foundation, Mike Bloomberg, and others. And even when not philanthropic, someone like Elon Musk is investing in innovation in electric cars, batteries, etc. What's the proper role in a sustainable economy of the wealthy?
So this is a sort of trickle-down theory of environmental action, and I just don't think it works very well at all. I mean, so even when someone is well motivated, like Bill Gates, their position in society severely restricts their vision. And I think he's highly mistaken in many of the approaches he takes, which are all technological, not economic or political. We need all three. We need technological change, but we also need economic and political change. And he's extremely resistant to those last two, because that would mean circumstances other than those in which he's reached the top of the tree. And, billionaires want to keep things as they are, or indeed, in many cases, want to make them worse, because those are the circumstances in which they've become billionaires. And we cannot afford to keep things as they are. This is why we urgently need political and economic change as well. I mean, you say the rich people consume more. Massively, massively. Those latest stats, I think 1% are consuming as much as the poorest 66% on Earth. It was something like that. The Oxfam stats came out in November or December. This is a huge disproportion. When it comes to billionaires, their carbon footprint can be, if we see a carbon footprint of 2 tons being, probably isn't now, but roughly a sustainable level, several thousand times greater than that. In some cases, tens of thousands of times greater than that. And it's, not just highly damaging in its own right, it's also highly damaging to morale, because, here am I trying never to buy bottled water, always turning off the lights, going everywhere by bicycle and by train, and doing my utmost to minimize my impact. And then you see some bloke whizzing around with a private jet between his massive super homes, where he gets into a super car and whizzes off to eat some bluefin tuna sushi. It's just, what's the point? That's what you say to yourself. what's the point of acting if these people can, each of them, cause thousands of times more damage than you are doing every activity in your life? And it's like what George Orwell said during the Second World War. He said, the lady in the Rolls-Royce car causes more damage to national morale than a fleet of Goering's bomber planes. And it's because if we see someone who's not pulling their weight, who's undermining the effort, then that undermines our morale and undermines our commitment to the effort as well.
Well, in this subject with pretty dire predictions and some serious challenges ahead of us, we like to end our podcast on a more hopeful note. So what gives you hope for the future, George?
Well, above all, it's the movements. And the thing about the movements is you never know where hope is going to come from. A few years ago, things looked really, really dire. There was just no progress at all. And then suddenly, there's a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl sitting outside the parliament with a notice by herself, and it sparks global movement, which very nearly, and if it hadn't been for the pandemic, I think would have triggered a social tipping, beginning to see a massive surge of green policies around the world. And then it all got shut down and we literally had to go home. We couldn't be out on the streets anymore. And so it ended that whole Fridays for Future thing and many of the associated movements as well. And it's very hard to rebuild from that. But one of the lessons you take is that extraordinary things can come from unlikely places. And, by the time she was 17, Greta Thunberg had changed not only the global conversation on climate breakdown, but also the global conversation on neurodiversity. Just extraordinary. One person can do that. And, seeing there's a wonderful film about her called I Am Greta. And you see, first of all, when she's completely by herself and these adults stopping and literally wagging their fingers at her. So you should be at school. This isn't doing any good. If you want a future, you should be educated and stuff. And then you see the very first arrivals of other people joining. And, first there's one girl saying, can I sit with you? And then there's another, and then there's another. And suddenly there's hundreds of them. And then, poof, it just takes off. And you just don't know where that's going to come from. And, we know that society, like all complex systems, has tipping points, and it can tip very quickly. And it's done so on many issues in the past, whether it's votes for women, whether it's equal marriage legislation, whether it's seatbelts, whether it's smoking, on so many ways. What seemed impossible in retrospect becomes inevitable, and those are the two equilibrium states in the complex system called society. One is impossible, the other is inevitable. And it's impossible, 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 and then suddenly, bang, social tipping happens, and well, of course, that was inevitable. That's how it is. So to despair is irrational because we don't know what's coming next. We don't know how things can change, and things can change very quickly and decisively indeed.
Well, George, that's an excellent note to end on. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.